everyone, and welcome to the next session of our interview series marking 200 years of Gregor Mendel. I'm Asta Vatsyayan, a PhD student in Dr. Vinya's lab, and today we have with us Dr. Chetana Sachidanandan, scientist at CSIR IGIB. Dr. Chetana's lab uses zebrafish as a model organism to study human diseases and has discovered new insights and potential therapeutic targets in diseases such as CHARD syndrome, Rubinstein-Tavy syndrome, hereditary hemochromatosis, and liver regeneration. Apart from her work here, Dr. Chetana is also an active member of the outreach community and routinely facilitates several events, activities, and magazine publications for the same. Welcome, ma'am. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. Ma'am, you've used zebrafish to successfully study different disorders. What would you say your current area of research focus is right now?
Right. So we have been interested in, or I have been interested in embryonic development since I was a PhD student. So, and that's my sort of driving force behind the different attempts that we try in the lab. Right now, we have been focusing, like you said, the names of the diseases that you mentioned, CHARD syndrome and Rubinstein-Tavy, etc. These are diseases that happen because of the developmental program going wrong. So the embryonic development that happens in mammals within the mother and in fishes outside, when that goes wrong, it's a very well-regulated, tightly sort of programmed event. And when that goes wrong is when diseases such as these happen. And these are called congenital disorders or birth defects. So our interest in development remains, but we are now looking more, we are getting more interested in what happens inside the brain. How does the brain develop, and how are the sort of the different circuitry laid down, how are the connections made? And sort of the overarching idea is that when these things go wrong, like what happens in a normal embryo and what happens when that goes wrong. And we have examples of that in humans with diseases, and we want to try and see what is going wrong inside the brain, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, go ahead.
Right. So basically, it's an extension of the work that you've already done. It's just a new area of interest, which is namely the brain.
Right.
Right.
And the model system will remain zebrafish.
Right.
I'm in love with this fish model that we have. Right. I started working on it in my postdoc. And one of the most beautiful things about this fish is that the embryos are transparent. And as a developmental biologist, when you want to look inside the embryo on what is going on at a cellular level or at molecular level, you have amazing tools that you can use to visualize the cellular movement, how the embryo forms, how from one cell, multiple cells divide, and then they rearrange themselves in particular formations to give rise to a developing or a functioning organism at the end of it every time. Right. So that's the beauty of that journey from one cell to the working organism. Right. And when I say every time, every successful time when we are standing in front of each other. But there are many, many situations where it doesn't happen, when things go wrong. If what goes wrong is severe enough, then the embryo dies in the process. Right. So in fish, you can actually catch that stage where the embryo is failing, the development is failing. Right. In humans, you would not see it because the embryo would be resorbed or miscarried or whatever. But that tells us how normal development happens, how these factors are very important, the genes that we are studying. I used the keyword genes. I was going to save it for later when your questions come. But these educate us on how a normal development happens, and how when that breaks down, something goes wrong, and at what point does that sort of breaking down happen. And how does that happen? That we can study in a model like zebrafish, which you cannot do in a mammalian organism, especially, of course, not in humans.
Right, right. That's fascinating. But you mentioned genes. So I would then ask, as a developmental biologist, and as someone who is studying genes and what's going wrong and at what stage, ma'am, what would you say, how much of an impact have Mendel's discoveries had on your work so far?
Right. I think none of us would be working if Mendel had not made that very crucial discovery.
Right.
And that comes from also, so I also wanted to point out the fact that his discoveries were made in a plant,
Right.
green peas, regularly used, very unimpressive kind of plant. But that discovery translates or transcends that organism, that kingdom, into all living organisms. So what we are trying to do is very similar, as in at a much more complicated molecular scale than Mendel was doing, is to look at an organism that serves as a surrogate for our interest in the larger questions of life. So how biology is governed by genes, that question can be addressed in any system that you pick up. Mendel did it in peas. We are doing it in fish. People do it in mice or flies or worms or whatever, right? And the answers that you get are many times universal. It gives us a window into the universal rules of biology. And that's what we are all after. So that sort of, that approach is something that we continue to use, that he used. But his discovery, when he found these elements that seem to be inherited, that seem to govern some color or pattern of the peas, he did not even know what he was like sort of opening the world into, right? And it took us many, many years to figure out that at a molecular scale, what this means. And now when we speak of biology, I think it is impossible to not refer to genes or not think about the proteins that the genes that come from the genes, or how these are impacting biological process inside the cell, and how that translates into the next generation. And I'm not talking about just next generation of the organism, but also the cellular next generation. These are things that we now implicitly understand. We don't even have to explain to each other. When you meet a person who is not familiar with these rules of biology, that you suddenly realize that what an amazing discovery it was, and how widely sort of it has impacted all of us. And that's not just science, but society as well.
Absolutely, ma'am. What a valid point. Not just science, but society at large. So, ma'am, do you think it is important for the common man also to study Mendelian laws? Would it benefit the common man to have a greater knowledge than they do currently of the laws set down by Mendel?
Right. So I think generally, from long time, from the time that human beings have started cultivating or modifying environment, domesticating animals or cultivating crops, we have been aware of this general impression that things are inherited, without really understanding the rules of it. And it has stood us well for hundreds of years. But in today's world, I think a little bit of, or I should say that it is important to correct the misinformation that might be prevalent in places from the sort of general observation that people make about inheritance. With the knowledge that we have the ability to correct wrong perceptions or direct actions in the right way, in the right direction, instead of going after non-scientific explanations for things. So that genetics allows you, the power of genetics today is that it is so widespread, and the challenge to us scientists is to simplify it to not get caught in the details of the inheritance. I mean, We know that the inheritance laws are not very simple. There are many layers of complexity in it, but that is too much information, and that confuses people when you hear it the first time. When I heard it first time as a student also, it confused me. So it is important to sort of start the narrative from a simple place, but if the person is receptive, then build it up to the complexity that you can sort of address. But it is, I think, it's essential for everybody to have a general impression. I am not saying everybody should know about DNA and genes and the molecules and all that, but there has to be whatever impression you have, it must be the correct scientific impression that we can give.
Right, ma'am. Ma'am, you mentioned simplifying things for the common man, conveying it in a very simple and easy to understand manner. That would fall under the umbrella of, I guess, outreach especially for researchers. Ma'am, what are some of the ways in which, as researchers, we can reach out to the community and, spread the message across, or just either convey the facts across in a very simple and easy to understand manner for the people? What would the ways be?
Right. So I think, by simplifying, I don't also mean that it should be dumped down, because I think people are intelligent enough to understand. You have to figure out how they will understand and learn the way that you want to speak. So, but outreach, I think, is not something that you decide I'm going to do and then go upon a mission of outreach. It is something that you cannot not do. So I tell my students that you have to be able to explain to your grandmother, who may not have any clue of what you're doing, what is it that you're doing and why it is important. Which means that I'm just using an example. You may have a scientist for grandmother and problem becomes much easier. But my point when I say that is that if you know enough, you will be able to understand what are the critical points that you have to mention to convey a message that you want to send. Like what I am doing, if I want to explain, I could talk about the single protein or the genes that I'm working on and how they affect each other and how it affects cell movement. It becomes too detailed and uninteresting.
Right.
So, but I have to understand that which part of that story is the important part that will convey the whole picture, and also explain why it is important. I'm working on it. I'm spending my life's sort of time on it. Must be an important question, right? So why I think that is important is something that is important to convey to the person next to you. And that is where outreach starts. I remember when I was a PhD student, and during the open day, you have people coming in from outside to look at your lab, you explain your work, you have your posters. And I remember receiving questions that I had no answers to. I was supposed to be this super scientist and was studying for PhD, and I knew everything about biology, but I could not explain what I was doing in an intelligible fashion to general people who were interested in what I was doing. They were ready to listen to me. Right. So that really kind of shakes you up, and you realize that, if you cannot convince another person or explain to another person, doesn't even have to be conviction, but explain to another person what you're doing, then you're not doing a good job. And we are all very much, scientists are, we are not very sociable people probably, or I am not. And it is difficult to talk to people. It is difficult to understand or think what they are meaning by the question that they're asking. But if you don't do it, then the misconception that we are just sort of, looking at problems that are irrelevant to the world or to the society, it spreads. Right. And the reason I'm working on something is because it is interesting and it is relevant to to life, right? And that I should be able to explain. So it starts from talking to your friends and your family, but it also goes on to talking to, say, visitors who come to the lab, or people you meet when you go to a college or school, and also to talking to general public. And For me, talking comes less naturally, writing comes better. So I like to write. And there are different levels to which you can make it like complex, right? So if I'm writing for a newspaper, I want to reach a larger audience. I want to kindle some interest in them for them to go and find out more. And information is like, there is enough information out there. There is so much information, but for a person, and we have only that much space in our brain. So people need to get interested in an idea, and then they can go and figure out where to get more information from. So that, I think, is something that I would like to address, rather than getting to the details of the science I do.
No, that's a very fascinating point. Just ignite a small spark and the person will go and themselves look for more information. Right. Ma'am, so like you said, we all work on something because it is important for people, for the society. Do you think with more outreach, with more awareness, eventually all the work that we do would actually end up shaping public policy in some way? Especially, for example, genetics. Do you think the knowledge of genetics, if more and more people have it, would it be able to shape public policy in some way? Because a lot of the work that you do is also translational in nature. Most of the work people do at some point will reach the common man. So do you think this knowledge, if it was more widespread, would actually help shape public policy in terms of healthcare?
Absolutely. I think even without that much outreach, it is shaping public policy. But what happens with half knowledge is that sometimes that is wrongly interpreted and policies are designed with the wrong idea. So complete or exhaustive information and better communication with policymakers, with public, of course, but also with policymakers, is an essential for conveying that or getting to the sort of the real scientific part of the decision making. And this is true in today's world for whether it is climate change or it is genetic engineering, right? So everything we do nowadays is so technology driven and so sort of sophisticated that you need knowledge. Otherwise, you are driven by either sort of general perceptions of things or some kind of knee-jerk reaction. And I mean, the last 2-3 years have been very good examples of how science can do wonders and how misinterpretation of science can lead to disastrous decisions also, right? And it is more and more important now. It was, I think, a little bit easier before when we didn't have so much jargon and so much complications or complexity in the kind of biology or science, whether it is environment or physics or whatever it is that we do. Now it has become so esoteric and so specialized that unless you communicate, unless you engage with the public, with the policymakers, with the government, whatever it is, you cannot have good sort of be on the same page. And that will lead to wrong decision makings. And then there is no point in getting sort of frustrated that it's not happening, right? I'm saying all this is the ideal world. I also don't do enough to communicate with the sort of people who make these changes. But that's something that we are all a little bit at fault with, I think.
Right. Ma'am, this brings me to my last question for today. Since it is so important to communicate, so important to talk to people, what would you, what advice would you give to researchers, people starting out in their PhD? How or what can they do so that the science actually reaches people as the common man? For example, just genetics, just better knowledge of genetics. What can we do in small, small efforts or large efforts? Anything. What can we do as researchers starting out that will actually help make a difference?
In my opinion, it has to start from you and your little surrounding.
Right.
Then you hone your skills, you discover what you're good at. But never feel, I would say that if somebody asks you what you work on, don't gloss over it. because they will not understand, they will not appreciate. They may think I'm just wasting my time, or it's too complicated and they are not smart enough to understand. None of these reasons are good enough for you to not explain what you're doing. I have made the same mistakes, and that is also why I am saying this, that it is important to respect the person in front of you, and start with the assumption that they will understand and appreciate what you're doing. And you need to engage. You will fail repeatedly. You will have arguments about things that you don't understand very well, that will make you go back and sort of sharpen your arguments, find out more information to see whether you were right or not. Sometimes you are wrong.
Right.
The opposite person might be right, and you have these preconceived ideas about science that are not right. You have to correct yourself with each engagement that you make, but you have to start it from the time you decide that I'm a scientist, and that is the time. And that time is when you commit yourself to doing science. It doesn't matter what level. You're a scientist, and you have to tell that story to any person who asks you what you do. Okay. And with that, you will improve, and you will realize that you're good at speaking, or you're good at drawing, or whatever it is, like videos or whatever it is. You can figure out your ways of communicating.
Right.
But start with answering that question seriously when somebody asks.
Right. This is, I think, something I also need to adopt. But you're absolutely right. We should not dismiss the person in front of us. And that's where we start, and that's how we learn. Thank you so much for making time for us and answering all these questions, ma'am. It was a very, very interesting session with a lot of very interesting takeaways.
The whole series is quite a great idea. And I think it's a great opportunity for people to also engage. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot.